He just walked away. Didn't even look back to see if I was following. Old Man Lorne, I think his name was, just nodded toward the control panel, mumbled something about keeping an eye on the numbers and was gone. Vanished through that steel door like he was afraid the building would collapse if he hesitated. Didn't offer to show me the break room or where the bathroom was or even, I don't know, basic human politeness. Just gone. And the door clicked shut with a sound that felt too final for a Tuesday night. The place smells like hot dust and something vaguely chemical, like burnt sugar but not sweet. The air is thick, even with the ventilation fans whirring overhead. It's a low constant drone that vibrates in your teeth. The furnace room itself is huge, mostly empty space dominated by the furnace, a monstrous thing of brick and metal, glowing orange through the small viewport. Gauges line the walls, needles twitching, dials glowing a sickly green. There's a smaller control room, partitioned off with glass, and that's where Lorne left me, with a chipped mug and a logbook open on the desk. The floor is concrete, scuffed and stained. I can already feel the grit under my boots. It's not exactly glamorous, but it's a paycheck. And right now, a paycheck is everything. Sarah's surgery, the bills are just piling up. The insurance company decided, after the fact, that experimental procedures weren't covered even though the doctor said it was standard. Standard. Like we had a choice. So here I am, babysitting a furnace for 12 hours a night, hoping I can keep the lights on. Emily keeps asking when I'll be home to build that Lego castle she wants. I'm writing this down actually just to, I don't know, to tell her I'm thinking about her. She won't be able to read it for years, but it feels better than just letting the thoughts drift. The logbook. That's what Lorne was so eager to get away from, I guess. Mostly just shift reports, temperature readings, fuel levels, notes about minor adjustments. Then about halfway through, the handwriting changes. It's tighter, more angular, and there's a list, numbered, starting on the next page. 1. If you step outside for any reason, wait at least 5 minutes before coming back in. I blinked at that one. 5 minutes seemed excessive. Probably just some weird safety regulation, maybe something to do with the heat or the air pressure. 2. If a phone rings on the premises after 10 p.m., do not answer it. Let it ring. If it stops and immediately starts again, leave the area. There's a phone on the wall by the door, an old rotary dial thing. I hadn't even noticed it. Who even uses a landline anymore? Still, seemed a little odd, like someone had a bad experience with a prank caller. 3. Do not laugh out loud when alone anywhere on the premises. Smiling is fine. Laughter alone in an empty space is an invitation. Okay, that was strange. I almost chuckled. An invitation to what? Ghosts? This place already feels unsettlingly quiet, but it's just the emptiness of it, the industrial hum. I can imagine someone getting lonely out here, though, and starting to talk to themselves. Maybe that was it. A previous employee who got a little too comfortable with his own company. 4. Do not bring any items that are yellow onto the premises. This includes clothing, accessories, food packaging, or personal items. I glanced down at my work boots. Black? Good. My jacket's navy blue? Okay. I don't even like yellow. It's a pointless rule, really. Superstitious nonsense. 5. If you notice new staining, discoloration, or markings on the walls, floor, or ceiling that were not there in the previous shift, photograph and report them. Do not approach within arm's reach. This one actually made me pause. It sounded official, like something to do with structural integrity. Maybe they've had issues with leaks or mold. I made a mental note to do a quick scan of the room before I got too comfortable. 6. Do not wear any fragrance, perfume, cologne, scented lotion on the premises. Wear only unscented products. I don't even wear cologne. Sarah buys me that stuff for Christmas, and it usually ends up gathering dust in the bathroom. 7. The north wing is accessible but must only be visited in pairs. Never go there alone. The logbook calls it the north wing. I hadn't even noticed a door leading that way. It's tucked behind the furnace, almost hidden in the shadows. I'll definitely avoid that. 8. Whoever leaves last must perform the following before exiting. Walk the perimeter once. That was weirdly specific. The perimeter of what? The furnace room? The entire plant? I'd have to ask about that in the morning. I reread the list, a knot forming in my stomach. It wasn't the rules themselves, exactly. It was the way they were written, the sheer arbitrariness of them, and the fact that Lorne hadn't said a word, didn't even seem to acknowledge they existed. I pushed the logbook aside and checked the temperature gauges. Everything looked normal. The furnace was humming along, doing its job. I glanced at the clock, 11:53 p.m., not even an hour in. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling that I'd walked into something off. I walked over to the small window overlooking the yard and watched a stray dog trot across the gravel. It paused, looked at me, then kept going. I kept watching it until it disappeared into the darkness. The air seemed colder now, even with the furnace roaring nearby. I shivered and pulled my jacket tighter. I spent the next hour doing rounds, mostly just checking the pressure gauges and listening to the furnace. It's a surprisingly rhythmic sound once you get used to it, a low, constant thrum that vibrates through the floor and up into your legs. It's hypnotic. I tried to focus on the numbers, on the steady green lines, on anything other than the list in the logbook, but it kept creeping back into my thoughts, especially that rule about not laughing. What kind of job is this? I'd brought a thermos of coffee, and I was nursing it slowly, trying to stretch it out. Sarah had made it extra strong, knowing I was starting the night shift. It was good, really good. I thought about her, about how she'd insisted on driving me to work even though it was out of her way. She was still a little shaky from the surgery, but she wouldn't hear of me taking the bus. I wished I could be home with her, making her comfortable, taking care of her. But the bills weren't going to pay themselves, and this job, as strange as it was a lifeline. Around 1:15 a.m., I realized I'd forgotten to grab the spare parts list from the office before starting. Old Man Lorne had mentioned it, something about potential issues with the burner nozzles. He said it was filed in the blue cabinet, top drawer. It wasn't essential. I could probably manage without it for the night, but it would make things easier if something did go wrong. And I knew Lorne would be angry if I had to call him out here for something preventable. The office was just off the main loading bay. A small, cluttered room with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was freezing in there. Colder than the furnace room. I dug around in the blue cabinet, finally finding the list tucked behind a stack of invoices. As I was straightening up, I noticed my phone. I'd left it on the desk. I hadn't even thought about it. Sarah had texted me earlier, just checking in. I wanted to reply, to tell her I was thinking about her, to reassure her that everything was okay, but I remembered that rule about not using phones. Something about disrupting something. I couldn't recall the exact wording. It didn't seem particularly important, just another arbitrary restriction. I figured a quick text wouldn't hurt. I unlocked my phone, typed out a quick message, "Everything's quiet here, thinking of you," and hit send. As soon as I did, I felt a shift. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like a pressure change in the air, a subtle cooling. I glanced up, scanning the loading bay. Empty, just the shadows stretching long and dark across the concrete floor. Probably just my imagination. I quickly pocketed the parts list and headed back to the furnace room. I walked through the doorway, and that's when I noticed it. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned, slowly, scanning the room. Nothing. I dismissed it as fatigue. Long shift, quiet environment, playing tricks on my eyes. But as I resumed my walk towards the control panel, it happened again. A fleeting shadow, darting across the floor, keeping pace with me. It wasn't following me directly, more like mirroring my movements. Every time I glanced over, it was gone. But I could feel it, a presence just at the edge of my awareness. I told myself it was the low light, the strange angles, my own anxiety, but the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I stopped, trying to regain my composure. I remembered something from the logbook, a fragment of a rule about re-entry, something about pausing when you go outside, a specific amount of time. I couldn't recall exactly how long. 2 minutes? 5? It felt important, crucial even, but the details were hazy. I'd dismissed it as more nonsense when I first read it. Now, standing here with this growing sense of dread, it felt different. I'd been outside for barely 30 seconds, just long enough to grab the parts list and send a text. I hadn't waited at all. I'd broken the rule, whatever it was. I continued my rounds, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It intensified, becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. It wasn't just a shadow now, it felt like an echo as I moved from the furnace to the control panel to the temperature gauges. I could sense something following, a silent, invisible counterpart mirroring my every step. It wasn't close enough to be seen, but I could feel its presence, a cold spot in the periphery of my vision. I tried to focus on my work, on the steady hum of the furnace, on the numbers flickering on the gauges, but it was impossible. Every movement I made was accompanied by a corresponding sensation, a subtle shift in the air, a prickling on my skin. It was relentless. I finished my rounds, checking everything twice. The furnace was stable, the temperatures were normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that I'd disturbed something I shouldn't have. I glanced at the clock, 2:30 a.m., still a long night ahead, and now it felt like I wasn't alone. I walked past the break room again and glimpsed something in the reflected glass of the door, a darker shape just behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. I needed to report this to someone, but to whom? Lorne was gone. No one else was on shift, I was on my own, and I knew, with a growing certainty, that whatever was following me wasn't going to just disappear. I'd broken a rule, and now I was paying the price. I had to keep moving, keep working. But every step felt heavier now, every breath shallower. The furnace room, which had seemed merely unsettling before, now felt like a cage, and I was trapped inside with something I couldn't see, couldn't understand, but could definitely feel. I needed to check the flow rate on line 4, but I couldn't shake the sensation of something moving in my blind spot, something keeping pace. I was checking the pressure gauges on line 6, the one that fed the smaller annealing layer. It was a tedious job, mostly because the gauges were old and the needles stuck, requiring a firm tap to get them moving. The glass in that layer was for smaller items, vials mostly, so the pressure didn't need to be as precise as on the main furnace lines. Still, it had to be checked every 2 hours. Old Man Lorne had drilled that into me during the handover, even though it felt a bit excessive. The metal of the gauge was cold under my fingertips, even through my gloves. It was always cold in this part of the plant, despite the heat radiating from the lair itself. The air here smelled different too, less like hot metal and more like dust, fine gray dust that coated everything. I ran a gloved hand along the pipe, leaving a clean streak in the grime. It was a losing battle, of course. The dust always came back. I got the first gauge moving with a sharp tap and noted the reading. Within acceptable limits. The second one, though, was stubborn. I tapped it harder, then harder again. Still nothing. I was about to grab a wrench when the phone rang. It was the old wall-mounted phone near the time clock, the one Lorne had warned me about. "Don't bother with that one," he'd said, "unless it's an emergency." He hadn't elaborated on what constituted an emergency. I hadn't given it much thought until now. It was well past 2 o'clock, well into the hours where the place should be silent. I ignored it, focused on the stuck gauge. It finally flickered to life with a particularly forceful tap. I scribbled down the reading and then glanced back at the phone. It had stopped ringing. A brief silence, then it started again. The same shrill, insistent ring. It didn't feel like a wrong number. It didn't feel like anyone trying to reach me. The silence between rings felt wrong. Too short, like it was waiting. I barely registered thinking about the logbook, about something I'd skimmed over, something about phones. After a certain hour, don't answer. Let it ring. I didn't analyze it. I didn't question it. I just moved. I walked quickly away from the time clock, away from the phone, past the open door of the break room, past the rows of cooling glass, towards the main furnace control panel. The ringing followed me, faint but persistent. It didn't seem to be getting closer or farther away, just there, an insistent hum beneath the roar of the furnace. I reached the control panel and leaned against it. My back pressed against the cool metal. The ringing continued, then abruptly stopped. I stood there for a long moment, listening. Just the furnace now, the steady, rhythmic hum. I'd moved without thinking, acted on instinct, on a half-remembered fragment of a rule. It was ridiculous, of course, Probably just a glitch in the system, a crossed line, but something about the way the ringing had stopped, the way it had resumed so quickly, felt intentional, like a test. I glanced back towards the time clock. The phone was silent. The break room door was slightly ajar, casting a long, distorted shadow across the floor. I shouldn't look. I knew I shouldn't, but I did. The room was empty, utterly, completely empty, but the air inside it seemed different. Thicker, stiller. I turned away, my stomach twisting. I needed to finish my rounds. I needed to focus on my work. I needed to pretend that none of this was happening. But the silence felt heavier now, and I knew, somehow, that I'd avoided something. Something that was waiting just beyond my line of sight. The gauge on line 6 still needed to be logged, and I knew with the same unsettling certainty that I would be checking that gauge again and again for the rest of the night. Not because it was my job, but because I needed to know if something had changed. I needed to know if whatever I'd avoided was still watching. I went to check the pressure on line 12. It was in the far corner of the building, past the cooling tunnels and the stack of ceramic molds we hadn't used in months. The walk was long, perhaps 5 minutes, and I usually used it as a chance to stretch my legs. The plant was quiet tonight, quieter than usual even. The furnace was doing its job, humming away, but the peripheral noises were muted. No clanging from the loading docks, no voices echoing from the office, just the steady throb of the heat. I found myself thinking about Maya, about her surgery. The bills were still piling up, even with the payment plan we'd negotiated. It felt wrong somehow, like we were always one missed payment away from everything collapsing. I pulled out my phone, intending to check our bank account again, just to reassure myself. Quincy had sent me a meme earlier. A stupid picture of a cat wearing sunglasses. I hadn't looked at it then too, focused on the readings. Now I tapped it open. It was genuinely funny, the kind of mindless humor that always got to me. I laughed. A short, sharp burst of sound. And stopped. Immediately. It wasn't a conscious decision. Not exactly. It was more like a reflex, a tightening in my chest, a prickle on the back of my neck. I just laughed, alone, in the plant, and I remembered something, a fragment of a rule, something about sound, about not making noise, about invitations. It wasn't clear, not precise, just a vague, unsettling feeling that I'd done something wrong. Ridiculous. It was a cat with sunglasses. It was dark, I was stressed, and the silence was getting to me. That had to be it. A little laughter wouldn't hurt anyone. This place was built for noise, for the constant roar of the furnace, for the clatter of machinery. A single laugh was nothing. I scrolled through my phone, looking for something else to distract me. Then, at the very end of the hall, the lights flickered. Just once. A momentary dimming so quick I almost missed it. They didn't go out, didn't even really waver, just a single, almost imperceptible flicker. I lowered my phone. I stared at the lights. I told myself it was the old wiring, the aging infrastructure of the plant. I'd heard Lorne mention the electrical system needed an overhaul. It was probably just a surge, a temporary fluctuation. Nothing to worry about. But I knew it wasn't. I finished checking the pressure on line 12. The gauge read steady, within acceptable limits. I logged the reading in the book, my hand shaking slightly. I didn't look back towards the lights. I didn't look towards the end of the hall. I just focused on the numbers, on the task at hand. I walked back towards the control room, faster this time. Not running, but moving with a purpose. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding any sideways glances. The silence felt different now, not just quiet, but expectant, like something was listening. I passed the break room again. The door was still ajar. The shadow still stretched across the floor. I didn't look. I needed to get back to the main console. I needed to check the other gauges. I needed to feel the solid metal beneath my hands, the familiar weight of the controls. I needed to convince myself that everything was normal. But it wasn't. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that something had shifted, something had noticed. I started logging the hourly temperature readings, but my hand kept slipping. I made a mistake on line 4, writing the temperature backwards. I corrected it, but the ink smeared. I crumpled up the page and tossed it in the bin. I couldn't seem to focus. I kept glancing at the hallway, at the end where the lights had flickered. They were steady now, burning with a harsh, unwavering glow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about them, something wrong. I'm going to start checking the lights every round. Every single round. It won't take much time, just a quick glance. But I need to know. I need to know if they flicker again. I need to know if I'm being watched. I was calibrating the thermocouples on furnace 6. It's a tedious job, requiring a steady hand and a good eye. Each probe needs to be seated just right, and the readings have to match the master gauge within 1/10 of a degree. Old man Hemmings, the day shift guy, used to say you could tell a man's character by how he did his thermocouple calibrations. I never understood that. It just seemed like a job to me. The metal was warm to the touch, even through the gloves, not dangerously hot, but enough to feel it radiating. The air around the furnace always smelled faintly of something sweet, like burnt sugar. It's the refractories, I guess. Or maybe it's just my imagination. It's a strange smell for a place that makes glass. I double-checked the readings on my tablet, making sure everything was within spec. This furnace is the oldest one in the plant, and it's always a little finicky. It needs constant attention. I tightened a screw on probe 3, then re-ran the calibration. Still a little off. I adjusted it again, a tiny turn, and checked the reading. Closer. I took a sip of coffee. It was lukewarm, but still welcome. I'd made it extra strong before my shift, figuring I'd need it to stay awake. I brought a new mug, a gift from Clara. It was a bright, cheerful yellow shaped like a sunflower. She knows I don't have much of a head for pottery, but she always tries to brighten things up. That's when I remembered the document. The one Pavel had given me on my first night. I hadn't looked at it in days, hadn't needed to. But something about the color of the mug I vaguely recalled a section. Something about restrictions, not on movements or sounds, but on things. Objects. It wasn't a clear memory, just a fuzzy impression of warnings. Something about attracting attention, about signaling. It felt ridiculous, even as the thought took hold. A bright yellow mug in a glass factory, it wasn't like I was waving a flag. Probably just tired. That's all it was. I hadn't slept properly in a week, not since Clara's surgery. Worry eats at you. And this job, the quiet, the darkness, it messes with your head. I finished the coffee, telling myself it was a perfectly normal mug, in a perfectly normal factory, and I was being perfectly normal to worry about it. But I couldn't shake the image of the document, the stark black type on faded paper. Or maybe it wasn't the document itself, but the way Pavel had looked when he handed it over. Not scared, exactly. More like resigned, like he was just going through the motions telling me something he'd told 100 times before. I set the mug down on the metal grating next to the furnace. It looked out of place, too bright, too cheerful, a splash of sunshine in a world of gray and shadow. I reached for my bag, a worn canvas duffel I'd had since college, and carefully placed the mug inside, zipped it up tight, out of sight, out of mind. I went back to the thermocouples, trying to focus on the task at hand, but it was no use. My mind kept wandering back to the mug, to the document, to the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I kept glancing at the hallway, at the shadows stretching across the floor. The air felt colder now, even with the heat from the furnace. My breath plumed out in front of my face. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to ward off the chill. I checked the pressure gauges again, just to have something to do. Everything was stable. Then I heard it. A faint humming sound coming from somewhere deep within the plant. It wasn't the usual hum of the machinery, it was different. Higher pitched, almost musical. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I paused, listening intently. The sound grew louder, then faded away. I checked my watch, 2:17 a.m., still hours until my break. I considered calling it in, just going home, but I couldn't afford to. Every shift was a paycheck, and every paycheck was a step closer to getting Clara the care she needed. I started my rounds again, walking down the long, dark hallway. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the shadows. I passed the break room, the door still ajar. The same shadow still stretched across the floor. I didn't look. I reached the end of the hall and turned the corner, and that's when I noticed it. The lights. They weren't flickering this time. They were just brighter, much brighter than they should be, and they seemed to be focused on a single point on the floor, about 10 feet in front of me, a spot of intense, almost painful light. I stopped walking. I stared at the light, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't a reflection or a malfunction. It was something else, something deliberate. And I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that it was watching me. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the light. I reached into my bag, fumbling for my flashlight. I switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I pointed it at the light, trying to dispel it, but it didn't work. The light remained, unwavering and intense. I turned and walked back the way I came. Faster this time. I didn't run. I just walked, quickly and deliberately, trying to ignore the humming sound that had started up again. I needed to get back to the control room. I needed to check the gauges. I needed to feel the solid metal beneath my hands, the familiar weight of the controls. I needed to pretend that everything was normal. But it wasn't. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that something was coming. I was calibrating the thermocouples on line 3. Tedious work, really. Tiny adjustments, watching the readings drift, tweaking again. It was the kind of thing that required focus, the kind of thing that could block out the quiet. Even with the hum of the building and the gentle hiss of the cooling pipes, there was a pressure, like the air itself was heavier than it should be. I kept my movements slow and deliberate, no need to rush, no need to draw attention to myself. The digital display on the thermocouple reader flickered, and I made a minute adjustment to the screw, 22 seconds. That was the longest I'd gone without glancing at the security monitors. I forced myself to look away from the readings, to scan the empty space beyond the furnace door. Just habit, I told myself. Just being thorough. It was a big plant. A lot of empty space. I'd finished the calibration on line 3 a little after 3. It was quiet, unusually so. Even the usual creaks and groans of the building settling seemed muted. I started making my way back toward the central control room, walking the same route I'd taken on my rounds a couple of hours earlier. I checked the gauges again, just to be sure. Everything was within acceptable parameters. The temperature was stable, the pressure was normal, everything was fine. I was passing the junction of Halls C and D when I saw it, a dark stain on the concrete wall. It hadn't been there earlier. I was certain of it. I'd walked this route checking the emergency lights less than an hour ago. The walls had been clean, gray concrete. Now, there was this. It wasn't a large stain, maybe a foot high and 8 inches wide, but the shape was wrong. It wasn't a random splodge or a drip. It looked almost intentional, like a distorted silhouette, something vaguely humanoid but stretched and pulled out of shape. It was hard to look at directly. My eyes kept sliding off it, focusing on the rough texture of the concrete around the edges. I paused, my hand hovering over the radio on my hip. Maybe it was just oil or some kind of industrial grime that had accumulated overnight. But it hadn't been there before. The thought prickled at the back of my mind, a cold, unwelcome sensation. I remembered something from the manual, something about markings, new markings. A sudden sharp recollection of the laminated pages, the stark black text. If you notice new staining, discoloration, or markings, do not approach within arm's reach. It was ridiculous, of course, an overreaction. This was an old factory, stains happened, but the image of the distorted shape stuck in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a stain. Probably just something someone tracked in on their boots, I thought, trying to reassure myself. Maybe Selma had been through here earlier and didn't notice she'd gotten something on her shoe. It was probably just that. But I couldn't dismiss the rule, not after everything. Not after the phone call. The lights, the feeling of being watched. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to calm my racing thoughts. I needed to document this. I needed a photograph. I reached into my bag, fumbling for my phone. My fingers felt clumsy and unresponsive. I pulled it out, activated the camera, and carefully framed the shot. I made sure to include a reference point, the emergency light fixture just above the stain, to show its location. I took 3 pictures, then another 3, just to be sure. The flash illuminated the stain, making it seem even darker, even more distorted. As I lowered the phone, I noticed something else. A faint discoloration on the floor, directly below the stain. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A darker patch of concrete, slightly smoother than the surrounding surface. It hadn't been there before either. I took a step back, instinctively. The rule: do not approach within arm's reach. I measured the distance with my eyes. I was easily 3 feet away. Safe enough. I told myself it was safe, but I didn't feel safe. I felt exposed. I looked around, scanning the hallway. Empty. Completely empty, except for the stain and the discoloration on the floor, and the lingering impression that something had been standing right there watching me. I felt a tightness in my chest, a knot of anxiety that wouldn't loosen. My throat felt dry. I needed a drink of water. I turned and walked quickly back toward the control room, my eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the walls. I kept my hand on the radio, ready to call for assistance if necessary. But what could I say? There's a stain on the wall? They'd laugh at me. Or worse, they'd think I was losing it. I reached the control room and slumped into my chair, my legs suddenly weak. I stared at the monitors, trying to focus on the flickering images, but I couldn't shake the image of the stain from my mind, the distorted shape, the discoloration on the floor. I started to review the security footage from the last hour, hoping to find some explanation. Maybe a worker had spilled something or tracked something in, but the hallway was empty. No one had been near the stain. It had simply appeared. And I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that this was just the beginning. I took a long sip from my mug, the bright yellow ceramic feeling strangely out of place, a jarring note in the sterile gray room. I hadn't even wanted coffee tonight. Clara had packed it for me, trying to be cheerful. Now it felt like a warning. I was calibrating the thermocouples in Furnace 3. It's a tedious job, really. Small adjustments, recording the readings, checking against the baseline. It takes 1 hour per furnace, and there are 6. Tonight I was aiming to get through 3, maybe 4, if I didn't get pulled away for another one of Pavel's urgent requests. He's the day shift supervisor, and he has a habit of calling even when he knows I'm the only one on duty. Usually it's something he could have easily handled himself. The heat radiating from the furnace was intense, even with the shielding. It wasn't the burning heat of flames, but a deep, permeating warmth that seemed to seep into your bones. I had the cooling vest on, circulating chilled water, but it only did so much. Sweat beaded on my forehead and trickled down my back. I wiped my hands on my trousers, trying to get a better grip on the calibration tool. It was a small, delicate instrument, and I didn't want to drop it into the molten glass. That would be a disaster. Not for safety, exactly, but for the paperwork. I'd been thinking about Clara a lot tonight. She'd been so quiet since the surgery. Not sad, exactly, just withdrawn. She kept saying she was fine, but I could see it in her eyes, the worry, the exhaustion. The financial strain was the worst part. We were burning through our savings faster than I'd anticipated. This job, as awful as it was a lifeline. It kept us afloat. I'd promised her I'd work every overtime shift I could get. I finished with the first thermocouple and moved on to the second. It was tucked away in a particularly awkward spot near the burner assembly. I had to lean over, contorting my body to reach it. That's when I smelled it. A faint floral scent. Lilacs, maybe? It was subtle, almost undetectable, but it was definitely there. I paused, sniffing the air. The plant usually smelled like hot metal and dust, a harsh industrial odor. This was different, pleasant even. I glanced around, expecting to see someone standing nearby, but I was alone, completely alone, just the humming of the furnace and the rhythmic clicking of the calibration tool. It must be my imagination, I thought. Or maybe something lingering from the cleaning crew. They used some heavily scented stuff sometimes. I dismissed it, focusing back on the thermocouple, but the scent persisted, growing slightly stronger. It wasn't the cleaning crew. It wasn't lingering. It was following me. I remembered the document. Rummaging in my bag, I pulled out the crumpled printout, flipping through the pages until I found it. I didn't need to read the whole thing again. I remembered the gist of it. Do not wear any fragrance. Something about scents leaving a trail. It felt ridiculous. A glass factory worried about perfume? Still, I remembered the feeling of dread that had washed over me when I first read it. I realized with a growing sense of unease that I'd put on some aftershave this morning. Just a small amount, a habit from before everything got so tight. Clara liked the smell. I hadn't even thought about it when I came to work. It was muscle memory, a part of my routine. I hadn't considered whether it was allowed. I rubbed my face with my hand, trying to wipe it off. It didn't work, of course. The scent was already absorbed into my skin. I felt a flush of heat creep up my neck. I'd violated another rule. Of course I had. It was getting to be a pattern. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Just a silly rule, an overabundance of caution. It was a factory, not a sacred temple, but the feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't the same as before, when I just felt generally uneasy. This was different, focused, like something was tracking me, following my movements. The scent seemed to swirl around me, clinging to my clothes, filling my nostrils. I needed to check the temperature readings in Furnace 2. It was on the other side of the plant, a 5-minute walk. I hesitated. The rule, something uses that residue as a map. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. But I had a job to do. I couldn't just stand here, paralyzed by fear. I had to maintain some semblance of professionalism. I started walking, keeping my pace brisk and steady. As I moved through the plant, I became acutely aware of my surroundings. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every sound seemed to echo. The scent of lilacs followed me, growing stronger with each step. I could feel it drawing something closer. I reached Furnace 2 and began the calibration process, but I couldn't concentrate. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there, just the empty machinery and the flickering lights. Then I realized I needed to access the control panel on the far side of the furnace. It was essential for the calibration. But to get there, I had to walk directly past the area where I'd first smelled the scent, where I'd first realized my mistake, where I'd confirmed I was being followed. I stood there, frozen. The rule. I couldn't go near it, but I had to finish the calibration. I couldn't explain a half-completed task to Pavel. I took a deep breath and started walking. As I passed the spot, I felt a coldness wash over me. It wasn't a physical chill, but a deep, penetrating coldness that settled in my bones. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I just kept walking, forcing myself to focus on the control panel. I completed the calibration as quickly as possible, then turned and walked back to the control room. The scent was gone, but the coldness remained, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I sat down at my console, my hands trembling slightly. I checked the security camera feed, scanning the hallway. Nothing, but I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't alone. I glanced at the yellow mug on my desk. It seemed to glow in the dim light, a beacon of defiance. I hadn't touched it all night. I didn't dare. I looked at the clock. 3 hours left. 3 hours to get through. And I knew with a growing sense of dread that the worst was yet to come. Clara would be waking up soon. I hadn't even started the letter I'd promised myself I'd write for her tonight. I just sat there, listening to the hum of the furnaces and waiting. The logbook needed updating. I always put it off, figuring I could do it during a lull, but the lulls hadn't come. Every few minutes, another temperature adjustment, another pressure gauge to check. It was relentless. So, during a relatively stable stretch, I pulled the chair away from the console and hefted the thick, spiral-bound book onto my lap. The plastic comb dug into my thigh. The entries were mostly mechanical. Furnace 1, stable. Furnace 2, within acceptable parameters. Furnace 3, minor fluctuation, adjusted. I flipped back a few pages, checking my handwriting. It was getting worse, scratchier, more cramped. I used to have neat penmanship. Clara always said so. I made a note to try and focus more on legibility. It felt important, like a small act of defiance against the unraveling. I was halfway through the Furnace 4 entry when I noticed the time, 2008 a.m. I hadn't even thought about it, about Clara, about whether she was asleep, whether the pain medication was working, whether she'd had a good day with Mom. I closed the book, a tightness in my chest I should call, even though I knew she'd probably be groggy and wouldn't want to be disturbed. It was just the silence. The endless, echoing silence of this place got to you. I pushed the chair back and stood, stretching my aching back. I needed to walk, to shake off the feeling of being compressed. I decided to check the storage wing, Section Gamma. It was mostly spare parts, old crucibles, things no one used anymore. But it was a large space and the walk would get my blood moving. The hallway to Section Gamma was long and narrow, lined with closed doors. Each door was metal, heavy, and painted a dull, institutional green. I remembered Lorne mentioning something about Gamma during my initial training, something about it being a two-person zone. He'd said it quickly, almost dismissively, as if it were common knowledge. Always go with someone to Gamma. Always. I hadn't really registered it at the time. Just another safety regulation in a sea of safety regulations. As I neared the entrance, the air grew colder. Not the usual chill of the plant, which was constant and predictable. This was different. This was stagnant. Like the air had been held in your lungs for too long. I told myself it was just the ventilation system. Gamma was rarely used, so the air probably just hadn't circulated in a while. I reached the double doors leading into Section Gamma. They were slightly ajar, which was unusual. Lorne was meticulous about security. Everything was always locked up tight. My fingers brushed against the cool metal as I pushed them open wider. The doors groaned in protest, the sound echoing in the cavernous space within. The rule. It came to me in a flash. Never go there alone. A vague, unsettling memory of Lorne's warning, suddenly imbued with a weight I hadn't felt before. The feeling wasn't exactly fear, not yet. It was more like a premonition of wrongness, a sense that something was fundamentally out of place. I glanced back towards the control room, the faint glow of the monitors visible down the hallway. Pavel was on duty. I could call him, ask him to come with me. But then I thought about the logbook, about how behind I was, about the mounting medical bills, about how I needed to get this done and get back to monitoring the furnaces. It was just a quick check, a routine inspection. What could possibly go wrong? It was probably just Lorne being overly cautious. He was an old-school plant man, always worried about everything. I stepped inside. The space was enormous, filled with towering shelves stacked with dusty equipment. The air was thick with the scent of rust, and something else, something vaguely sweet, like burnt sugar. It wasn't unpleasant, exactly, but it felt intrusive. Like it was trying to fill a space that should have been empty. I took a few steps further, my footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The feeling of wrongness intensified. It was like the air itself was pressing against me, making it hard to breathe. I scanned the shelves, noting the inventory. Old crucibles, mostly. Some broken molds, a few corroded heating elements. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the deeper I went, the more I felt watched. Not in a threatening way, but in a curious, assessing way, like I was an exhibit in a museum. I told myself it was the isolation, the darkness. The fact that I'd had too much coffee before my shift. I was letting my imagination get the better of me. It was time to finish this and get out. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, just at the periphery of my vision. It wasn't a shadow cast by any of the objects in the room. It was separate. Autonomous, it flickered and danced, shifting in shape like smoke. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't dare turn my head. I didn't dare acknowledge it. I just stood there, rigid, hoping it would disappear. It didn't. Instead, it began to move closer. Slowly, deliberately, and as it moved, the feeling of wrongness escalated into something far more profound. Something ancient and unknowable. A sense of overwhelming dread washed over me, so intense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I didn't react. Not at first. I just stood there, paralyzed, as the shadow continued to approach. Then, instinctively, I took a step back, then another, and another. I walked backwards, slowly, deliberately, until I reached the doorway. until I was back in the hallway, until I was safe. I didn't look back. I didn't run. I just walked, quickly but steadily, back to the control room, my heart thudding against my ribs. The scent of burnt sugar lingered in my nostrils, and I knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever was in Section Gamma was still there, waiting, and that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I never wanted to find out. I'd need to find Pavel even if I didn't have a good explanation. He would need to go with me if I ever had to be near Gamma again. I could feel a new tremor starting in my hands, not from cold, but from the sheer weight of unacknowledged avoidance. The last hour of the shift always felt the longest, not because of any change in pace, but because of the knowledge that I was one rotation closer to seeing Sarah again, to being home. I was in the break room, making instant coffee. The machine sputtered and groaned, a familiar sound that usually annoyed me, but tonight it was comforting. A predictable failure in a place full of unpredictable everything. I'd switched to decaf. I didn't need any extra jitters. The medical bills were enough to keep me wired. I stirred the coffee, watching the granules swirl. It smelled like burnt cardboard, even for instant coffee. I was down to the last of the creamer, a tiny plastic container that felt precious for some reason. I rationed it carefully, squeezing out every last drop. It was a stupid thing to focus on, but it was a distraction. A small, manageable problem in a sea of enormous, unmanageable ones. I glanced at the clock. 27 minutes left. I finished the coffee and rinsed the mug, placing it in the small drying rack. The break room was spotless. I'd taken to obsessively cleaning during these shifts. It was something to do, something that made the time pass a little faster. Tidying up felt like I was reclaiming some semblance of control in a place where I had none. I wiped down the counter, then checked the hallway for any discarded cardboard or stray wrappers. Nothing. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed, a constant, monotonous drone. It was a sound that usually faded into the background, but tonight it felt particularly intrusive, like it was drilling into my skull. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the feeling. It was just the exhaustion, just the loneliness. It was almost time to go. I walked back towards the control room, passing the main entrance. The door was unlocked, as always. Pavel usually secured it before he left, but he was off tonight. Selma was covering his shift tomorrow. I thought about Selma. She always smelled like mothballs and peppermint, a strange combination. I reached the control room and did a quick sweep of the monitors. Everything was stable. The furnace temperatures were holding steady. The pressure gauges were within normal limits. I double-checked the readings just to be sure. Old habits. I'd been doing this job for weeks and still felt the need to verify everything, even when I knew it was probably unnecessary. Then I remembered the document, the checklist. I hadn't seen anyone else come or go for hours. I was definitely the last one here, and that meant the ritual. I frowned. It seemed so utterly ridiculous. A list of things to check, to say, to walk. Like some sort of bizarre superstition, I'd mostly dismissed it as the ramblings of a paranoid plant manager. But after everything else, after the phone and the shadow and the discoloration, I couldn't entirely ignore it. I tried to recall the specifics, something about lights and rooms and a perimeter walk. It wasn't coming back to me clearly. I remembered the sequence felt uneven, like it wasn't constructed with any kind of logic. Just a random assortment of tasks. I decided to just go through the motions, get it over with. I started with the lights, flicking each switch on and off, moving systematically through the control room, the hallway, the storage area. It felt absurd, pointless, like I was performing a meaningless pantomime. But I pressed on, trying to ignore the nagging sense of unease. I told myself it was just a waste of time, just an old man's eccentricities, just a way to make people feel like they were doing something important when they weren't. I finished the lights and moved on to the rooms. Control room, I said, my voice sounding hollow in the silence. Storage area, break room. I paused. Was that it? I couldn't quite remember. There was something else, something about walking, the perimeter. I started toward the main entrance, intending to walk the outside of the building. It was cold out, the air crisp and biting. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. As I reached for the door handle, a low thrumming filled the air. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent. It vibrated through the floor, through my feet, through my bones. It was coming from the furnace room. I froze. It wasn't a sound I'd heard before. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was organic, like a giant heartbeat, and it was getting closer. I hesitated for a split second, then pushed the door open and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing pulse. It was just the furnace. Something was off with the machinery. That's all it was, but the thrumming continued, growing louder with each passing second. I glanced back at the building. The windows of the furnace room were dark, ominous, and then I remembered the perimeter walk. I hadn't done it yet. I hadn't completed the ritual. I started walking, following the outline of the building, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The thrumming intensified, resonating in my chest. It was almost unbearable. I picked up my pace, desperate to finish the walk, to get it over with. As I rounded the far corner of the building, I saw it, a faint discoloration on the concrete. It wasn't the same as the one I'd found in Section Gamma. This was different. It was smaller, more contained, but it was undeniably there, and it was directly in my path. I stopped. I couldn't step on it. I couldn't risk whatever it was. I glanced back at the door, then at the discoloration. I had to finish the perimeter walk. I had to complete the ritual, but I couldn't bring myself to step over it. I took a deep breath and detoured around it, adding an extra few feet to my walk. It felt wrong. It felt like a violation, but I couldn't help it. I just wanted to get out of there. I finished the walk and hurried back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I unlocked the doors, started the engine, and drove away, not looking back. It wasn't until I was halfway home, listening to the radio, that I realized I'd said the rooms aloud in the wrong order. Break room, I'd said. Storage area. Control room. It was a small thing, a minor detail, but it was enough. It was enough to know that I hadn't done it right. The thrumming, though faint, still resonated in my ears, and I knew, with a sinking feeling, that something was waiting. Waiting for the next shift, waiting for someone to leave last, and waiting for someone to forget. The drive home was uneventful. That felt like a victory in itself. I didn't see any headlights behind me. I didn't feel like I was being followed. Just the hum of the tires on the highway, the static crackle of the radio. I told myself it was the exhaustion, the lack of sleep that had me so keyed up, that the thrumming I still felt, a phantom vibration in my teeth, was just residual stress. It had been a bad night, a really bad night, and I needed sleep. I skipped the coffee I usually grabbed on the way. I didn't want anything else messing with my system. I just wanted to get home. See Sarah, kiss Lily before she was fully awake. The house was quiet when I let myself in. The smell of sleep and lavender laundry detergent filled the air. I found Sarah in the kitchen, already up, making breakfast. She looked tired but relieved. "You're back," she said, her voice quiet. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, fine. Long night." I didn't tell her about any of it. Not the discoloration, not the thrumming, not the feeling of being watched. What could I say? That I was pretty sure I'd messed up some ancient factory ritual and now something was waiting. She'd had enough to deal with lately. I ate a piece of toast, dry, and went to Lily's room. She was stirring, her eyes fluttering open. I sat on the edge of her bed and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She smiled, a sleepy, gummy smile. That was good. That was real. The next few weeks settled into a routine. Work, sleep, family. I kept the overtime shifts. I needed the money. The medical bills hadn't stopped coming. I found myself checking the rearview mirror more often, not for cars, but for something else. It was stupid. I knew it was stupid, but I couldn't shake it. I started noticing the angles of shadows differently. The way they pooled in corners, the way they shifted with the light. I'd always been oblivious to that kind of thing. Now, I traced their edges with my eyes looking for. I didn't even know what I was looking for. Just something off. I stopped wearing aftershave. It felt exposed, like I was sending out a signal, It wasn't a conscious decision, it was more like an aversion that grew until I found myself reaching for unscented lotion instead. Sarah noticed and asked if I was sick. I just said I was trying something different. I started counting things. Tiles on the kitchen floor, steps to the bedroom, knots in the wood grain of the table. Just counting. It didn't calm me exactly. It just occupied my hands, my mind. It gave me something concrete to focus on when the thrumming started up again, a faint echo that seemed to come and go with the weather. The job posting went up again a few weeks later. Overnight furnace monitor. Same pay, same hours, same everything. I scrolled past it without a second thought. I just couldn't go back. I still write the letters to Lily, though, every night after she's asleep. They're not about the plant. They're about her day, about the things she said, about the way she laughed. But sometimes, when I'm writing, my hand pauses. When I look up, I'm staring at the wall, at the way the light falls across it, and for a split second, I see it, a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration. It's always gone when I blink, but it's there. And every time it appears, I feel a cold spot on the back of my neck. It doesn't frighten me anymore. It just is. I reach for a yellow highlighter, needing to mark a passage in a storybook, and then I stop. My hand lowers. I pick up a blue one instead.